Hey there! Today we're going to be going over Chapter 12 and discussing different issues and sociological perspectives when it comes to gender, sex, and sexuality. When we're talking about gender and sex, it's important to note the difference in their definitions. Sex and gender are not interchangeable terms, as they are not the same. Sex refers to the physical or physiological differences between males and females, including both primary sex characteristics like the reproductive system and secondary characteristics like height and muscularity. Gender, on the other hand, refers to the behaviors, personal traits, and social positions that society attributes to being male or female. Gender is what we call a social construct because it reflects ideas about how someone should act or behave according to social norms based on their sexual organs. A person's biologically determined sex does not necessarily correspond to his or her gender. These characteristics that are associated with each sex can vary significantly between different cultures. The dichotomous view of gender is the notion or concept that someone is either a man or a woman, and there's no other gender identity in between. The dichotomous view of gender is specific to certain cultures, but it's not universal across all cultures. In some cultures, gender is viewed as more fluid and not just put strictly into two categories. For example, you have the Hijra of India, and they've been considered a third sex in India for over 4,000 years and were considered highly respected and almost mystical figures throughout India's long history. Another example are the Fa'afafine of Samoan culture, meaning the way of the woman. The Fa'afafine is considered a third gender and has always been part of Samoan society. And the third example I have on here are the Native American Berdache, or the Two-Spirit, which referred to a third gender made of individuals who occasionally or permanently lived and dressed as a different gender. The Berdache had important roles in ceremonial rituals. They were believed to possess healing powers and were used as good luck charms during wartime. Like gender, each society interprets sexuality and sexual activity in different ways, with different ideas about premarital sex, the age of consent, homosexuality, masturbation, etc. The incest taboo is one of the few cultural universals that is shared by most societies, meaning that it is against social norms and viewed as a wrong or illicit act to participate in incest across almost all societies. Individuals are socialized to sexual attitudes by a lot of our major social institutions like the family, education, our peers, the media, and our religion. Of all the industrialized countries, Sweden seems to be the most liberal in terms of attitudes about sex, including sexual practices and openness. Sweden has very few regulations on sexual images in the media, and sex education is required and begins at age 6. Sweden's rates of teen pregnancy and STDs, however, are among the world's lowest. One international study found that Americans' tolerance for premarital sex, sex before age 16, extramarital sex, meaning cheating on your spouse, and homosexuality was lower than for people in most other industrialized countries. Recent surveys of young adults have shown a shift in attitudes, however, with younger Americans more supportive and tolerant of many of these behaviors. U.S. is restrictive when it comes to attitudes about women and sexuality. In the U.S., it's widely believed that men are more sexual and have the right to more sexual urges than women, and that creates a little bit of a what's called the double standard. And that double standard means that premarital sex is generally prohibited for women, but allowed for men and almost glorified for men. So for instance, a man who has a lot of sexual partners but is not married is often viewed as, like a player or Don Juan type character, but women who participate in a lot of premarital sex with different partners are viewed more as sexually promiscuous or of bad moral character. So that is kind of that double standard when it comes to gender and sexuality in the United States particularly. According to a CDC study, the average 35-year-old woman has had 3 sexual partners, while the average 35-year-old man has had 6. So you can see where that kind of double standard and these cultural norms when it comes to gender and sexuality and beliefs about marriage can have had an effect, obviously, since it seems that men have about twice as many sexual partners than women. Unlike in Sweden, sex education in the United States is not required in all public schools. The teenage birth rate in Sweden is 7 out of every 1,000, but the teenage birth rate in the United States is 49 out of every 1,000. In addition, STD cases in teens are 600 times lower in Sweden than in the United States. The major point of controversy in the United States is not about whether or not to teach sex ed, but about the type of sex ed that is taught, mostly concerning the issue of abstinence. In 2005, 15% of Americans supported abstinence-only programs. 46% believed an abstinence plus approach should be used, meaning promoting abstinence but also educating about protected sex. And 36% of Americans felt abstinence was not important to teach and that the focus should be on sexual safety and responsibility. So as you can see on the graphic here, it says 1 in 4 teen births is to a young woman between 15 and 17. That's nearly 1,700 babies every week born to teen mothers, and 83% of teens say that they didn't receive formal sex education before they first had sex. So I've linked to kind of a humorous look at sex education in the United States and kind of the different debates and conflicts that go on when we talk about kind of institutionalizing sex education in our public school system. So I'd like y'all to watch this. It's a clip from the John Oliver show, but he shows kind of historical videos and about sex education from the United States from the 60s and 70s and kind of where sex ed is today. For instance, in the United States at the federal level, there's no requirement for sex ed in schools, and there's only 22 states that mandate sex education be taught. So most sex education is really left up to the school or the school district. So it's kind of a hodgepodge of different kind of strategies and theories and beliefs when it comes to sex education across the United States. And kind of the main point that he makes is that in a country, in a nation where we have a public school system, just as we do with many other subjects like history or science, there's certain standards that must be met, but we don't really have that in the United States. So in terms of sex education, there's really no standard, and it's really left up to local officials. So now we're going to talk a little bit about sexual orientation. So sexual orientation refers to a person's physical, mental, emotional, or sexual attraction to a particular sex. And there's 4 different broad categories of sexual orientation. First is asexuality, and this is someone who really doesn't feel an attraction to either sex. They don't really have a drive to have sex with someone of either sex. Then we have bisexuality, and that's the attraction to people of either sex or both. So a woman would be attracted to both other women and men. And third, we have homosexuality, which is the attraction to the same sex. And heterosexuality is attraction to the opposite sex. So generally, the United States is a heteronormative society. And so if heterosexuality means attraction to the opposite sex, then a heteronormative society means that the society as a whole assumes that biology determines your sexual orientation. So a man belongs with a woman belongs with a man, and really nothing other than heterosexuality is considered normal or accepted. So heterosexuality is the only normal and natural expression of sexuality according to heteronormativity, and the idea that being gay or being asexual is a choice arises from these very heteronormative ideas. Alfred Kinsey was a researcher and scientist who was studying human sexualities during the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. And he did this by interviewing individuals and couples across the country about their sexual history. He and his team concluded that people do not fit into exclusive heterosexual or homosexual categories, but instead people kind of occupy a range of sexual preferences along a spectrum. So instead of assigning people to 2 strict categories of either heterosexual or homosexual, Kinsey's team used a 7-point scale, and it ranges from 0, meaning exclusively heterosexual, to 6, representing exclusively homosexual. And then he added an additional category of X to apply to individuals who had no sexual inclination or desire. Again, that's asexuality. And Kinsey's team, over the years doing their interviews with all sorts of different people, found that most people's sexual orientation actually fits somewhere between 0 and 6, meaning that most people don't really fit into kind of these exclusive heterosexual or homosexual categories. Most people kind of find themselves somewhere in between those two. So here we're going to turn to sexual orientation and discrimination in the United States in particular here. So homosexuals and bisexuals are treated differently than heterosexuals in school, in the workplace, and the military. More than 1/4 of gay and bisexual individuals claim that they have experienced discrimination. So a couple important terms to keep in mind here. The first is homophobia, and that refers to an extreme or irrational aversion to homosexuals. And the second is heterosexism. This is an ideology and set of institutional practices that privilege heterosexuals and heterosexuality over other sexual orientations. Heterosexism represents a systemic disadvantage embedded within our social institutions, offering power to those who conform to a heterosexual orientation. So some examples would be the U.S. military's Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, which was introduced by Bill Clinton in 1993. And he introduced it intending to kind of make things better for homosexuals in the military, but it still got a lot of heat and criticism because it required homosexuals in the military to keep their sexuality undisclosed. So in other words, it was fine for them to be gay or bisexual, but you couldn't tell anyone. You had to keep your identity and your activities secret, which obviously kind of felt like a bit of an oppression to a lot of the men and women who are serving our country. And then if that secret did get out, it was acceptable to kick them out of the armed services. So this was, the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy was overturned by President Obama in 2011. Another example would be the Defense of Marriage Act, which was passed in 1996, and it limited the definition of marriage to a union between one man and one woman, but allowed individual states to decide whether or not they recognized same-sex marriages. Similar to Don't Ask, Don't Tell, this was overturned by the Supreme Court recently in 2013. So now at the federal level, gay marriage is legal, and it's not up to each individual state to decide. And if you look over at that map on the right, you can see before the ruling by the Supreme Court that legalized gay marriage, this was kind of the breakdown of where you could get married if you were in a homosexual relationship and where you could not. So all the green states, Florida, New York, Pennsylvania, Washington, Colorado, California, etc. You could get married to your homosexual partner there, but in most of kind of the middle of the country, the heartland, it was illegal. And a third example of kind of heterosexist practices in the U.S. would be Proposition 8 in California that was passed in 2008, which limited marriage to unions of opposite sex partners. Again, a ruling in California in 2010 ruled Prop 8 unconstitutional due to kind of backlash, of course. So in 2015, the Supreme Court in the United States ruled on the case OBERGEFELL versus HODGES. And the Supreme Court decided that the right to marry is fundamental with their ruling on the case. And Justice Kennedy wrote that under the 14th Amendment's protections, couples of the same sex may not be deprived of the right and liberty to get married. Before the ruling, gay marriage had already been made legal in 37 states and Washington, D.C. By either legislative or voter action, or by federal courts that overturned state bans. But as of 2015, and this Supreme Court case, OBERGEFELL versus HODGES, gay marriage is legal on the federal level. So before we really get into gender, we're just going to look at some theoretical perspectives when it comes to sex and sexuality. So structural functionalists would argue that the regulation of sexual behavior is important to ensure marital cohesion and family stability. To them, the family unit is the most integral component of society, and everything that gets in the way of family preservation and reproduction is, quote, dysfunctional. So the purpose of confining sexual activity to monogamous heterosexual marriage is to intensify the bond between the spouses and to ensure that procreation occurs within a stable relationship, which can provide the offspring the best possible chance for appropriate socialization and provision of basic resources. So for a structural functionalist, homosexuality at a large scale would be considered, quote, dysfunctional because procreation would cease. Now, conflict theory would say that sexuality is another area in which power differentials exist and where dominant classes actively work to promote their worldview along with their economic interests. For example, when examining the struggle over the right to gay marriage, a conflict theorist would claim that powerful, rich, and heteronormative people are imposing their belief on the subordinate people by denying them the right to marry, but also barring them from all the legal entitlements that marriage brings, like Social Security benefits and medical insurance. And our symbolic interactionists would focus on the meanings associated with sexuality and sexual orientation. For example, they might look at changes in the way we talk about sexuality or understand it or diagnose it. So before 1973, the American Psychological Association defined homosexuality as abnormal or deviant disorder. And that kind of shaped social attitudes by defining homosexuality as pathological or evidence of some sort of disease. Today, however, that's changed, and the American Psychological Association no longer cites any connection between sexual orientation and psychopathology. For another example, an interactionist might focus on their research on different slurs used to describe homosexuality, which is meant to kind of demean or feminize them, and how those labels kind of affect the people who eventually come to perceive themselves perhaps that way, leading to negative self-image. And then I'm going to introduce kind of a fourth theory in this chapter. It's called queer theory, and queer theory kind of is rooted in conflict theory, but kind of goes a step beyond it. So queer theory is a relatively new branch of sociological inquiry when it comes to sex, sexuality, and gender. And it represents an interdisciplinary approach to sexuality. It critiques Western society's rigid splitting of gender into male and female roles. And queer theory questions the manner in which we have been taught to think about sexual orientation. And queer theorists advocate for a more fluid and flexible conceptualization of sexuality. Similar to conflict theory, queer theory interprets the current schema of homosexual or heterosexual as pitting one sexual orientation against another. And this mirrors other oppressive schemas in our society, such as those surrounding class, gender, and race. So queer theory is based on the concept of, here's another term for you, intersectionality. And this refers to a complex and cumulative way that the effects of different forms of discrimination, like racism, sexism, and classism, combine, overlap, and intersect, especially in the experiences of marginalized people or groups. So we're going to turn toward focusing on gender for the remainder of the lecture. So we'll start with gender roles. During the socialization process, children are introduced to certain roles that are linked to their biological sex. A gender role refers to a society's concept of how men and women are expected to look and how they should behave. Gender roles define the rules of appearance and behavior that are based on norms created by society. So in our society, masculine roles are often associated with strength, aggression, and dominance, and feminine roles are often characterized by passivity, nurturing, and subordination. This role learning begins at birth. For example, people buy pink gifts for little baby girls and blue gifts for baby boys. Children also learn gender roles through play and toys. Like little boys tend to play with trucks, toy guns, and superhero figures that are more active toys that promote motor skills, aggression, and solitary play. But little girls play by and large with dolls or play kitchen sets and dress-up apparel that foster a more nurturing social proximity and role play. And then I put just a little 1-minute video at the bottom here. If you haven't seen it, it's a video of a little girl named Riley, and she's in the toy store with her dad. And she's kind of realizing at such a young age, maybe 6 or 7 years old, that a lot of the toys that she wants seem to be marketed to boys. And she kind of ask the question, why is this marketed this way? Why are there toys that are only for little boys and toys that are only for little girls? So much of our understanding when it comes to gender roles and kind of these socialized sexual differences that are also supposed to have an effect on our personality and how we define our gender and our actions are rooted in institutional discrimination and socialization. So we'll start again with a couple terms. Sexism refers to prejudiced beliefs that value one sex over another, and gender stereotypes form the basis of sexism. So institutionalized discrimination, meaning that discrimination is built into the social structure against women in the United States, still remains, even though we have come a long way. So gendered socialization occurs through 4 different major agents of socialization: the family, education, peer groups, and the mass media. So the family, number 1. Parents socialize sons and daughters differently. Usually there's different chores and rules assigned to sons and daughters. For instance, girls do the dishes and laundry and might have to be home by 9 p.m., and boys take out the trash and help with lawn work and don't have a curfew. A second kind of institution where we experience gendered socialization is the education and in schools. So teachers at young ages usually divide students into lines of boys or girls, or they seat the classroom boy-girl by boy-girl. And studies show that teachers have more patience with and are more lenient on male students, as well as they tend to give more praise to male students as well. The third institution is our peer groups, our reference groups of friends. And these are sources of criticism or ridicule to individuals who don't fit neatly into their assumed gender role. So a lot of kind of trans and gay students are subject to a lot of bullying, especially in middle school and high school. And It's mostly due to the fact that these people don't really fit into kind of these heteronormative role and behavior that we're kind of socialized into accepting. And so that can also cause a lot of bullying being done against gay or students who just don't fall into kind of these heteronormative expectations. And then the fourth institution is the mass media. So if you think about female roles in television, advertising, and film, until very recently, things have gotten better, but for most of U.S. history, female roles are usually relegated to secondary supporting characters, or lead female characters will usually fit into what we call the Madonna whore role set, where the Madonna is the pure, good woman who sacrifices constantly, and the quote whore is a hypersexual evil woman. So a lot of feminist scholars and critics will say that although in the media men have a lot of different kind of personalities and a lot of different personalities and a lot of different roles that they play, usually women until very recently were kind of either cast as the Madonna, this pure wonderful woman, or the whore, this kind of promiscuous woman with evil intentions. And if you think about commercials, they also reinforce gender roles as well. So advertisements for childcare, cleaning, or kitchen products almost exclusively feature female characters playing the role of the housewife. And then there are two secondary agents that kind of socialize us into gender roles, and those are religion and the workplace. So for instance, in some denominations of the church, women can't hold leadership positions. And in the workplace, women might be expected to take on roles as like party planners or asked to make coffee for the office staff. Or women managers might sometimes feel pressure to be more nurturing than a male manager might be. And this kind of socialization into gender roles from the time that we're really born, it, of course, kind of has an effect over time in terms of what occupations females and males tend to go into. So masculine and feminine gender roles continue to be constructed and reinforced into adulthood. Certain occupations are more likely to be done by men, like law enforcement, military, or political leadership, while others are more likely to be performed by women, like childcare, healthcare, and social work. Of course, women have only very recently gained the level of equality that we see today in the United States. In 1809, women gained the right to leave a will. In 1840, women gained the right to own and control property. In 1920, women gained the right to vote. And in 1963, with the passage of the Equal Pay Act, women gained the right to be paid as much as a man for the same work. However, even with all the progress made, there are definitely still inequalities left between men and women. Men vastly outnumber women in authoritative, powerful, and therefore high-earning jobs. Even when a woman's employment status is equal to a man, women generally make about 77 cents to a man's dollar. And in addition, women also take on a disproportionate share of unpaid housework. And this is referred to sometimes as, quote, the double duty of women. So they have to go to work during the day, work 8 hours, and then they come home and are also responsible for taking care of the children, cleaning the house, cooking dinner. And so it's kind of like a second shift of work. So once they've left their official job at the office or wherever, they get home and they kind of have to clock in for their second shift of being like the housewife. And especially in like the 1970s, there was a pretty solid movement that was organized called Wages for Housework. And it was groups of women that would protest, and they were fighting for the right of women to receive compensation from the government for their unpaid work as housewives. And the argument is that women are the ones who are kind of reproducing the nation's labor force and taking care of them and feeding them and making sure they're healthy, intelligent adults that will enter the United States labor force eventually. And so kind of the argument was that housewives are playing this really pivotal role in society by reproducing kind of the labor force and the next generation of citizens. And so they demanded that they should be paid kind of a wage for this kind of reproductive labor. So this video here you can find in the PowerPoint or on Blackboard under Chapter 12, Content. But it's just a quick kind of recap of the 2018 World Economic Forum report on gender equality around the world. And the report compares many different countries in terms of kind of gender equality, and in particular looks at like the political empowerment of women in leadership in all these different countries. And the report concluded that the United States will not truly achieve gender equality for another 208 years. And this was in 2018, so 206 years now. And as you can see, the rankings of political empowerment of women here, the United States is behind Pakistan and Kazakhstan, Korea, Togo, so I hope y'all will watch this video. It's very short, just a little recap of this 2018 report that was released. So another study that looks at gender and gender equality at an international level is the Gender Parity Index. So in 1997, when the Gender Parity Index was performed, the United States ranked 45th out of 179 countries in the world for the percentage of women in the House of Representatives, and that was 13% women at the time. As of 2019, the United States fell from 45 to 78th place, with now about 23.5% of the House of Representatives is made up of women. So we kind of fell, though, in international standards, even though the percentage went up for us in terms of comparing it to other countries, we fell behind. So in 2019, the top 5 countries for gender parity in political leadership are here: Rwanda, Cuba, Bolivia, Andorra, and Mexico. However, you can see, I had to clip it because it's a very long list, but you can see over here on the right, at number 78 is the United States, followed by Montenegro, Lesotho, Singapore, Malawi, Guinea, Chile, the Czech Republic. So the United States, in terms of gender parity in political leadership for women, is falling quite behind a lot of other countries around the world and most industrialized countries. And then a few more little factoids that came out of the 2019 Gender Parity Index study found that women are 51% of the US population. However, they make up only 25% of the US Senate, 23% of the US House of Representatives, 29% of statewide elected executives, 29% of state legislative seats, 22% of mayors in cities with populations over 30,000, and of course, we have not yet had a female president. So this slide shows an image of a map of the U.S. The map illustrates which states have the highest representation of women in their state legislatures. So the darkest purple states represent the states that have the highest proportion of women in elected office, like Maine, Oregon, Washington, Nevada, while the lighter purple represents the states with the least representation by women in elected office. And you can see Georgia has some of the least women in office, Texas, Tennessee, Louisiana. Now, when we're talking about gender and gender parity and women's kind of status in society, it's hard not to talk about feminism in a sociology class. So the next several slides, we're going to talk about the three major waves of feminism in the United States. So the first wave occurred around like 1840 and went to about 1930. And first wave is represented by this picture here, is mostly concerned with letting women earn the right to suffrage and the right to vote. And then the second wave kind of came about in the 1960s up to about 1990. And this one was mostly focused on equality in the workplace, being able to attend co-ed schools, being able to be more than a secretary in the workplace. And this movement is kind of what brought about all this focus on gender parity in terms of earnings and wages between men and women who do the same job. And then we are currently still in the third wave, which started around 1990. And the third wave focuses more on certainly the issue of abortion, but still encompasses a lot of what the first and second wave was focused on as well. And the third wave, also like the Me Too movement, certainly falls into the third wave of feminism. So first, let's delve a little bit more into detail about first wave feminism from about 1840 to 1930. So at the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention, which was the first women's rights convention, attendees signed the Declaration of Sentiments, which began with this quote right here. So we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpation on the part of man toward woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. Then in the 1860s, women's suffrage organizations emerged and organized. Advocates of the temperance movement argued that women should have a greater role in decisions concerning public life. In 1916, the National Woman's Party formed to advocate for an amendment to the U.S. Constitution for women's right to vote. And in 1919, 3 years later, the 19th Amendment passed in the United States Senate, stating that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Now, although first wave feminism made a lot of great strides for women, there certainly was room for critique, and one of the most famous critiques comes from an African American woman named Sojourner Truth, and she is really well known for a speech she made at a women's convention titled "Ain't I a Woman?" So one of the major common criticisms of first wave feminism was that it wasn't a movement primarily organized for all women. It was mostly organized by and for white women, and with the interests of white women at the forefront. So in 1851, at a women's convention in Ohio, Sojourner Truth, who was a former slave and future preacher, stood up and made a brief speech that brought to light the racial inequalities ignored by the women's movement at the time. She successfully pointed out this double standard existing within the movement and was a voice for the Black women who felt unrepresented. Her famous quote from the speech is as follows: "That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches, and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman?" So that's her famous question that kind of brought to light this kind of discrepancy between the lived experience of white women versus Black women at the time. And this speech really kind of struck a nerve with the feminist movement and pointed out that the problems and issues that a lot of first wave feminism was concerned with didn't really speak to the lived experience of a lot of Black women at the time. And on this slide, and of course also linked to on Blackboard, is a short reenactment of Sojourner's Truth, Ain't I a Woman, performed by KERRY Washington. So if you want to see the whole speech, I think it's only about 3 minutes long, definitely watch that. It's pretty moving. Now, second wave feminism kind of kicked in around 1960 and lasted until through the 80s to about 1990. And second wave feminism revolved around the women's role in the household, women's demand to join the workforce, greater expression of women's sexuality, and the fight for reproductive rights. So in 1963, there's a housewife and a writer named Betty Friedan, and she published a book called The Feminine Mystique, which is said to have kind of triggered the beginning of this second wave of feminism. So I have a quote here from her book, and it says, "The problem lay buried unspoken for many years in the minds of American women. It was a strange stirring, a sense of dissatisfaction, a yearning that women suffered in the middle of the 20th century in the United States. Each suburban wife struggled with it alone, as she made the beds, shopped for her groceries, matched slipcover material, ate peanut butter sandwiches with her children, chauffeured Cub Scouts and brownies, lay beside her husband at night. She was afraid to ask even of herself the silent question, is this all?" So the second wave is really revolves around kind of this role of the housewife and this kind of rebellion against that role. And on this slide, I have another short video that kind of looks at the history, the historical context when the feminine mystique came out, and talks to different women, historians, and feminists about kind of what that book meant in terms of sparking this second wave of feminism. So it was during this second wave of feminism that the organization NOW was founded, and NOW is the National Organization for Women, and they found that in 1966. The group NOW, their priorities were to enforce laws banning employment discrimination against women, promote maternity leave rights, child care centers that would enable mothers to work. They promoted tax deductions for child care expenses and equal and unsegregated education and job training opportunities for poor women. In 1965, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission granted women more access to jobs across the country, and employers with histories of gender discrimination were required to provide timetables for increasing the number of women in their workforces. Now, Selma James is a famous feminist that kind of arose out of this second wave. And I have a quote from her over here on this graphic. It says, "Caring for others is accomplished by a dazzling array of skills in an endless variety of circumstances, as well as cooking, shopping, cleaning, laundering, planting, tending, harvesting for others. Women comfort and guide, nurse and teach, arrange and advise, discipline and encourage, fight for and pacify. Taxing and exhausting under any circumstances, this service work, this emotional housework is done both outside and inside the home." So in 1953, Selma James, who was a New York City factory worker and a mother, published her pamphlet. It was called A Woman's Place. And she's a conflict theorist and feminist and advocates for her primary cause, which I mentioned several slides ago, that movement for the wages for housework, which was kind of this demand for a guaranteed income for housewives from the government. And she argues that women take on, again, that double duty of waged labor in the official workforce, but must also perform unwaged labor at home during that, what I call that second shift of work for housewives. And the labor that James claims is the basis for caring for and reproducing the current and future labor force. And if you want to read her pamphlet from 1953, I have a link to it here on the slide. So just open up the PowerPoint slide and you can access that. So in 1972, Congress passed Title IX of the Higher Education Act, and this prohibited discrimination on the basis of sex in any educational program that receives federal funds. Thus, the Higher Education Act forced all male schools to open their enrollment to women and athletic programs to sponsor and finance female sport teams. The next year, in 1973, is when the renowned U.S. Supreme Court case, Roe versus Wade, was ruled on, and the Supreme Court legalized abortion. So like the first wave, where Sojourner Truth was quite critical of the first wave feminists, Second wave feminism did not escape a very similar critique for being blind to the problems of poor, non-white, and non-heterosexual women. So the Black feminist and writer, her name is Bell Hooks, wrote a renowned book called Feminism is for Everybody during this second wave. And this book actually, in many ways, set the stage for the third wave of feminism, which has proved to be a lot more inclusive than the first and second. But I have a quote from her book here. It's a bit long, but I'm gonna go ahead and read it for y'all. So she writes, "In those days, white women who were unwilling to face the reality of racism and racial difference accused us of being traitors by introducing race. Wrongly, they saw us as deflecting focus away from gender. In reality, we were demanding that we look at the status of females realistically, and that realistic understanding serve as the foundation for a real feminist politic. Our intent was not to diminish the vision of sisterhood. We sought to put in place a concrete politics of solidarity that would make genuine sisterhood possible. We knew that there could be no real sisterhood between white women and women of color if white women were not able to divest of white supremacy, if feminist movements were not fundamentally anti-racist. Critical interventions around race did not destroy the women's movement, it became stronger. Breaking through denial about race helped women face the reality of difference on all levels. And we were finally putting in place a movement that did not place the class interests of privileged women, especially white women, over that of all other women. We put in place a vision of sisterhood where all of our realities could be spoken." So third wave feminism really embraces ideas about individuality and diversity. Third wavers promote queer theory, Black feminism, and intersectionality. So again, intersectionality assumes that each person possesses a multitude of different identities that shape who they are and how they experience the world around them. Humans embody their identities in a way that's unique to them. So intersectionality relates to the systemic oppression of minority populations, and it's a crucial element of modern feminist theory. Discussions on intersectionality often include sex, gender, race, socioeconomic status, ethnicity, religious belief, sexual orientation, age, and ability. And all these different kind of aspects of our personal identity can be regarded as creating overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination, oppression, or disadvantage. For instance, the oppression one experiences as a poor Black woman is compounded as that individual would reside in kind of this intersection of oppression based on their economic status, their race, and their gender. So third wave feminism places less of a focus on political activism and more emphasis on personal empowerment and social change. Instead of focusing on the wage gap between men and women, a third waver would look to gender constructs and gendered socialization and ask why young girls and women are not pursuing careers in the STEM fields, which yield the highest salaries. And one famous third wave activist and the woman who kind of came up with this term intersectionality is Audre Lorde, who's in this picture here on top, and have just a quote from her which kind of encapsulates this idea of intersectionality, which is, "There is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives." So for the next couple slides, we'll move on to talk a little bit about gender identity and gender identity discrimination. So of course, we'll start with a helpful definition. Gender identity is a person's deeply held internal perception of his or her own gender. So we have both a transgender and transsexual. Transgender is when a person who identifies with the role that is different from their biological sex. So the key here is that they just identify with a different gender role. Transgender males have a strong emotional and psychological connection to feminine aspects of society that they identify their gender as female. The parallel connection to masculinity exists for transgender females. And about 2 to 5% of the US population is transgender. Then we have transsexuals. Transsexuals are individuals who attempt to alter their body through medical interventions like surgery or hormonal therapy so that their physical being is more in line with their gender identity. So the key difference, transgenders identify with a different gender role. They might dress like the opposite sex, but a transsexual actually goes through kind of processes and practices to physically change their body so it's more in line with the gender that they feel they are. So not all transgenders do or want to alter their bodies. Now in 2010, the American Psychiatric Association replaced its term gender identity disorder with gender dysphoria. So before then, the scientific community was labeling transgender and transsexual individuals as having a gender disorder, a stigmatizing term that implies that person is diseased or unhealthy. But the new term, gender dysphoria, refers to individuals whose gender at birth is not aligned with their gender that they identify with. So changes in these clinical descriptions may contribute further to a larger acceptance of transgender people in society because it's no longer being framed by the medical community as a disorder, implying that something is wrong with the person. So transgender workers report unemployment at twice the rate of the population as a whole, and they're 4 times more likely to be living in poverty. Transsexual and transgender individuals are twice as likely to become victims of hate crimes and discrimination than non-transgender individuals. And sadly, the rate of suicide attempts is 4 times greater for LGBTQ youth. In a national study, 40% of transgender adults reported having made a suicide attempt at some point in their life, and 92% of these individuals reported having attempted suicide before the age of 25. So now let's talk a little bit about the different sociological, theoretical perspectives when it comes to analyzing gender. So we'll start with our structural functionalists, who would argue that gender roles are established well before modernity, when men took care of responsibilities outside the home and women took care of domestic responsibilities in and around the home. For example, the man as the hunter and the woman as the gatherer. These roles are functional because women were often limited by the physical restraints of having and raising children. But once established, these roles were passed on to new generations in order to keep the family system functioning properly. So a structural functionalist would think that kind of going outside of your gender role, as society has normalized it for you and socialized you into certain gender role, to kind of transgress that social norm when it comes to gender would be dysfunctional, because you are kind of questioning these social standards for men and women, which are based in, according to structural functionalists, are based in kind of our DNA, and kind of norms that have existed long before industrialization and modernity and capitalism. On the other side of that coin, we have our conflict theorists, who would argue that the social construction of gender and the division of the sexes leads to a struggle for dominance between men and women, where men are the dominant gender and exploit or oppress the subordinate gender of women. So Marxist theory would argue that the antagonist role of the capitalist and the worker is mirrored in the antagonistic relationship between men and women. And this is due to women's dependence on men for the attainment of wages and the means to live. So Marxist feminist theory would argue that the role of the nuclear family perpetuates male dominance, and it would strongly critique patriarchal society, wherein men's contributions are seen as more valuable than women's, and women's viewpoints tend to be silenced or discredited. And if you're interested in seeing a kind of modern day society that functions by promoting matriarchy instead of patriarchy, go ahead and watch this video I've linked to down here, and you can find it on Blackboard. It's about an hour-long documentary on the Masu in China, which is kind of an old community that's still in existence today, and the culture there really holds women up as kind of the strong dominant gender in their society, and men are kind of just viewed as like these carefree, almost like adult children. Women are really in charge of the household. Women are the ones who are kind of bringing in the most resources, and a certain degree of kind of sexual promiscuity is allowed of both men and women. So it's pretty interesting little documentary on this matriarchal tribe from China, if you would like to take a look at that. And lastly, we'll look at the symbolic interactionist kind of perspective on gender. Again, symbolic interactionists would pay attention to the critical role of symbols and meaning making in our day-to-day social interactions. So how do we, as members of our society, kind of aid in the construction and reinforcement of gender roles through our actions and experiences on a daily basis? So a symbolic interactionist would focus their research on maybe aspects of, quote, doing gender. And that term doing gender refers to when and how people perform tasks or exhibit characteristics based on the gender role assigned to them. So you can see the little picture I have over here. How do we do gender? And you notice children, even from a very young age, kind of start to internalize their gender role according to their sexual identification or assignment. So you can see this little boy, he looks real tough and aggressive, and the little girl looks very sweet and submissive. Another thing that symbolic interactionists would pay attention to when it comes to gender is kind of this performativity of gender. So gender is something we do or perform, not something we are. And they would claim that gender is, again, a social construct. So socially created definitions about the cultural appropriateness of sex-linked behavior shapes the way that people see and experience gender. And so a lot of researchers on gender, especially within this kind of school of symbolic interactionism, would look at kind of all these different gender stereotypes that exist in our society. So, for example, in this bottom graphic here, you have kind of a list of the general characteristics that we assume are aligned with the different gender roles of feminine and masculine. And so generally, when you think of a feminine personality, you think of someone who's not aggressive, they're dependent, easily influenced, submissive, passive, home-oriented, emotional, indecisive, talkative, gentle, sensitive, desirous of security, cries a lot, very verbal, kind, nurturing. Whereas when we think about kind of masculine characteristics associated with men or boys, we've kind of been socialized to think of masculine traits as aggressive, independent, not easily influenced, dominant, active, not hurt emotionally, decisive, not talkative, tough, not sensitive, doesn't cry a lot, very logical and analytical, perhaps cruel or blunt, and not very nurturing. And that brings us to the end of this lecture on Chapter 12, Gender, Sex, and Sexuality. And I hope you all have a great week, and I'll see you back next week for Chapter 13.